Hello, everyone. We are getting started. It is great to have you all here. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Food Systems and Nutrition Training for Business. It's great to have you here and have a wonderful lineup for this event. So this is an outreach event by the PSM and the CFS, and we are thrilled to be able to provide this for the business sector. Before we get started, though, I wanted to go over some light housekeeping. The event is being recorded, and it will be made available to participants next week. By remaining on this webinar right now, you are agreeing to be recorded. I would also ask you if you could kindly rename yourselves by clicking on the right-hand side of the bottom of your screen or by your name. That would be very helpful. We're very pleased to have interpretation available for this event. So if you require Spanish or Portuguese interpretation, please select that icon at the bottom of your screen to activate the channel. We invite you to use the chat function to post any questions, and the host will be in direct contact with you. You will also have the raise hand option. And as of now, you should all be muted. If you have a question and are given the floor, please unmute yourself. As we all know, due to these COVID times, we are used to using these video conferences and some of their common hiccups. So we have measures in place with our team to ensure the integrity of the call. So should there be a disturbance, please just bear with us and we will restore order shortly. And now I'm thrilled to give the floor to our distinguished chair of the UN Committee on World Food Security, Ambassador Gabriel Ferrero, who will provide some welcome remarks and introduction into the voluntary guidelines on food systems and nutrition. Over to you, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Rosemary, and welcome to all participants. And thank you for joining this business training session on food systems and nutrition. I have met many of you probably in the past in my different capacities, maybe as team leader of David Navarro's team or as my government official, as Spanish government Director General for Development Policies. It's my pleasure to see you, those of you once again that I met before, and for those of you whom I haven't yet met, I am the chair of the UN Committee for World Food Security, recently elected just last month, and I'm delighted to welcome you today to this event where we will be focusing, as Rosemary already said, on the CFS voluntary guidelines on food systems and nutrition and on their relevance to food systems transformations. So, dear friends, well, as you know, the Committee on World Food Security is the most relevant international inclusive platform where governments come together with the United Nations agencies and programs, and notably FAO, WFP, and IFAD, as well as with the business community articulated through your mechanism, through your private sector mechanism, also with civil society organizations that are articulated through the civil society mechanism. We all come together to agree on voluntary guidelines, principles, and recommendations on key issues needed to achieve a zero hunger world through sustainable and inclusive food systems. And we used to start all these processes with scientific evidence provided by the Committee on World Food Security's high-level panel of experts. Well, we all know, colleagues, that the situation is critical. Hunger is on the rise, with nearly 700 million people chronically undernourished and as many as 130 million people being pushed into hunger after the COVID-19 pandemic. We know that 2 billion people suffer from micronutrient deficiencies, that overweight and obesity are on the rise as well, increasing the risk of non-communicable diseases. In addition, we know that health diets are out of reach for more than 3 billion people. At the same time, agriculture and food systems account for almost 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions, and it's the main driver of biodiversity loss and soil degradation. The Food Systems Summit, celebrated the last September 23rd, convened by the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has brought into a historic momentum around the need of transforming our food systems in a way that deliver food security, adequate nutrition and healthy diets for all people, while providing decent jobs and incomes to farmers, food producers and rural dwellers in a way that are carbon neutral, that reverse biodiversity loss and restore ecosystems. In a nutshell, food system that ensures that the achievement of SDG 2 while contributing to substantively to the rest of the Sustainable Development Goals. Well, despite the challenges, there are also plenty of opportunities in this ecological and just transition needed on food systems. Smallholder farmers, family farmers, small and medium enterprises are all agents of this transition, and they are the primary actors. Businesses across the world, many of which come from the Americas and are represented here today, are already undertaking transformations on your business models across value chains to ensure a positive impact for people on the planet of your businesses. Your markets are expanding in this way. Your shareholders see their investments less risky and in the longer term, more profitable, and your clients are already valuing more and more your brands. Governments in this transition are increasingly providing policies, investments, regulatory frameworks, and incentives to those farmers and companies that deliver on the SDGs. So in this context, colleagues, during the last 5 years, the Committee on World Food Security has been working hard to achieve a global consensus on what guidelines may inspire and orient the efforts of all the stakeholders at all levels on their efforts, on your efforts, towards the shared understanding of what complex issues such as the notion of food systems or healthy diets, or what does sustainable food systems imply, not least on equitable livelihoods or climate change. As a result of all these 5 years of work, the committee endorsed recently the voluntary guidelines on food systems and nutrition. This was last February. We started with an expert report of our high-level panel of experts and agreed. It was the voluntary guidelines were agreed by consensus by 133 member states, by civil society, private sector, UN agencies and experts, the CGIAR, and the World Bank, amongst others. These guidelines, in which we are going to be focusing today, aim to support countries and all stakeholders, including the business community, to develop multi-sectoral national policies, laws, programs, investment plans, or business models for health diets through sustainable food systems. The voluntary guidelines call for interventions and investments within and across food systems and their constituent elements, and these include food supply chains, food environments and consumer behavior to enhance livelihoods, health and well-being of all people. The guidelines encourage sustainable food production and responsible consumption of diverse and nutrition foods to enable healthy diets, protect and promote sustainable use of natural resources, biodiversity and ecosystems, and support mitigation and adaptation to climate change. Well, colleagues, this complex process and lengthy process leading to a global consensus would have been impossible without the leadership of a very capable chair of this negotiation process. So it is my pleasure to have here today with us His Excellency and dear friend, Ambassador Hans Hoeven, formerly permanent representative of the Netherlands to FAO and currently chair of the independent chair of the FAO Council. So welcome, Ambassador, welcome, Hans. Ambassador Hoeven played this central role facilitating this process. It is a great opportunity to have him today here providing an overview of these guidelines. Ambassador, before giving the floor to you, allow me to introduce also the excellent panel we have to discuss how regional food systems and nutritional challenges and the potential for businesses to use these tools. The panel that will follow your presentation, Ambassador, will start with Ms. Marcela Rodriguez Jimenez. She is the Regional Coordinator of the Alliance of Food and Beverage Associations in Latin America, the Alianza Latinoamericana de Asociaciones de la Industria de Alimentos y Bebidas. Next, we will have Mr. Nick Gardner, the U.S. Dairy Export Council, his Senior Vice President for Sustainability and Multilateral Affairs. Welcome, Nick. Joining us from Rome is Ms. Stinike Onema, my dear friend and the UN Standing Committee on Nutrition Coordinator. Welcome, Stinike. It's a pleasure, as always, seeing you. We will also have, together with us, the Deputy Director, Joy Day, from the Inter-American Institute for Cooperation on Agriculture. It's a real pleasure to have you joining this session and provide EICA and regional insights on nutrition. And finally, we'll benefit from the insights of Ms. Maria Nelly, the Private Sector Mechanism Representative and Vice President of Corporate Affairs of Cargill Latin America. Welcome, Maria. We look forward to the panel preparing us for a rich discussion, followed by some brief concluding remarks from my side. I am hopeful that you will find this event informative and useful, and again, let me welcome you to this second Voluntary Guidelines on Food Security and Nutrition Outreach event for business, which will be followed by one dedicated to the Africa and Europe community. Before I turn to His Excellency Ambassador Hugebend to provide an overview of the CFS guidelines, allow me to share with you the following 4-minute video on the guidelines.
Hunger and malnutrition in all its forms, such as undernutrition, micronutrient deficiencies, overweight, and obesity, are a major global challenge. The latest report on the state of food security and nutrition in the world projects up to 811 million people having been chronically undernourished in 2020, amounting to a total of around 928 million people living in severe food insecurity. 3 billion people cannot afford a healthy diet, which will likely rise because of COVID-19. Malnutrition in all its forms also remains high, especially for children under the age of 5. Malnutrition in all its forms has profound consequences on people's health and well-being. It affects their physical and cognitive development, and it alters their livelihoods throughout their lifetimes and across generations. To reverse these trends, countries should develop policies and undertake actions aiming to transform their food systems to deliver healthy diets and improve nutrition, and protect biodiversity and the environment. The Committee on World Food Security, the CFS, is the foremost inclusive body for coordination, discussion, and formulation of international food security and nutrition policies. CFS recently endorsed its voluntary guidelines on food systems and nutrition to address malnutrition in all its forms through a holistic food systems perspective by providing guidance on policies and interventions, considering food systems in their totality, and promoting policy coherence between sectors relevant to food systems and nutrition, like health, agriculture, education, environment, gender, social protection, trade, and employment. The voluntary guidelines were developed by hundreds of representatives of governments, UN agencies, civil society, and the private sector, as well as financial and research institutions. They were informed by the scientific evidence of the CFS High-Level Panel of Experts on Food Security and Nutrition, short HLPE. The voluntary guidelines are the first multilaterally negotiated document of its kind on the connections between food systems and nutrition. They recognize the strong interlinkages between sustainable food systems and healthy diets. They call for interventions within and across food systems and their constituent elements such as food supply chains, food environments, and consumer behavior to improve their ability to deliver healthy diets and to generate positive outcomes along the 3 dimensions of sustainable development. They present agreed texts on key concepts such as healthy and unhealthy diets, nutritious foods, and sustainable food systems. The guidelines focus on 7 thematic areas: transparent, democratic, and accountable governance, sustainable food supply chains to achieve healthy diets in the context of economic, social, and environmental sustainability and climate change, equal and equitable access to healthy diets through sustainable food systems, food safety across sustainable food systems, people-centered nutrition knowledge, education, and information, gender equality and women's empowerment across food systems, and resilient food systems in humanitarian contexts. We count on all of you to use these guidelines and promote sustainable food systems that deliver healthy diets. Partner and collaborate with other relevant initiatives and platforms, and promote the dissemination, use, and application of these voluntary guidelines. Use them to foster and guide inclusive dialogues among different institutions, sectors, and stakeholders within the food system. The hunger and malnutrition challenge is worsening. The guidelines are a tool to address it. Use them.
Thank you very much indeed. A wonderful video, and with no more time, over to you, Ambassador Hugeven, for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabriel, Chair of CFS, new Chair of CFS, and of course I wish you a lot of success in your new job, and you certainly need it for the next coming years. And ladies and gentlemen, it's more than an honor and a pleasure for me to be with you. Our actions are our future. That was or is the theme of the World Food Day this year. And it's all about transformative change we certainly need. And you have seen the dots don't connect anymore. We are bringing tourists into space, but it is a moral outcry that we still have more than 800 million people living in poverty without enough food, and especially nutritious food. It's an increase of 160 million people since last year. As was said in the video, we have 3 billion people who don't have access to affordable, safe and nutritious food, and 2 billion people with obesity. And let's not forget that we are losing 1/3 of our yearly produced food because of food loss and waste. And it has a value of $1 trillion. Think about what we can do with $1 trillion for transforming our food systems. And of course, with COP26 ongoing, we are deeply concerned with the climate change. And if we don't act, it will lead to an unprecedented collective failure, which threatens not only the safety of our people, but also the future of our planet. And we as member states over the last couple of years have been champions in setting goals and targets, but till now, we are still failing to implement them. We have less than 9 years to go for achieving our sustainable development goals, but we know that we are lagging far behind. A month ago, we have had the World Food Systems Summit, and for the first time in many years, we have been discussing the food systems at the highest level at the UN, which of course very much needed. And heads of states, CEOs, heads of agencies clearly committed to change, committed to transforming our food systems. So we have to use this momentum. But moreover, we have to translate those beautiful words and those beautiful commitments into action. Swords into plowshare, that's what you see at the statue at the UN headquarters. And of course, we have to focus, and perhaps only focus at this moment at the national level. How can we support governments? But moreover, how can we support other stakeholders to transform our food systems? And that, I think, there we need transformative change as well, because we need the private sector, we need you as companies more than ever to transform our food systems, because you are best placed for the change with your companies, and I think with your expertise and your investments. And I've chaired the negotiations of the voluntary guidelines in the beginning of this year. It was 350 hours of negotiations in a virtual space. And although all members, and that's remarkable, all members said they are committed to implement these guidelines, and of course, which is a step in the right direction, none of them have yet incorporated it in their national legal systems. So that's still a challenge to do. But when you look to the voluntary guidelines, and I wish that they would not be voluntary, but that's a step too far for the Committee on Food Security. As was said in the video, it's the first negotiated multilateral agreement on how to change our food systems. During the Food Systems Summit, of course, there was, I would say, a cry for concrete action. But when you go into the voluntary guidelines, you see concrete actions formulated to be implemented not at the global level, but at the national level. And I think that's what we need. It's everything about food systems and everything about how to change into the direction of healthy diets. And it's a coordinated action by everybody, not only by government, as I said, but certainly for the private sector and civil society. And it also lays bare how important the link is between sustainable food systems and healthy diets. And we can only achieve it if we join forces together, especially at the national level. And when you look and go into the voluntary guidelines, it was said it has 7 areas. And the great thing of the 7 areas is that they are very much very concrete. It's about transparency and accountability, and not only for governments, because of course we need governments to create an enabling environment, for example, for investments of the private sector. But we need also accountability of the private sector and our value chain. And that you can find in chapter 1. In chapter 2, it's everything about the different elements of achieving healthy diets and transforming our food system in a more sustainable way. It's not only about economics, it's also about social and environment. And if you look concretely into the guidelines, you will see many elements, also, for example, climate adaptation and mitigation. You see promoting the management of natural resources in the best way. You also see how to take care and concrete suggestions and guidelines for making sure that we can protect the health of our food system workers. It's about storage, processing, and packaging, also to avoid food losses. Of course, in the 3rd chapter, you see guidelines about equal and equitable access. And that's, I think, very important when you try to transform our food system in a more sustainable way and make sure that we have affordable, healthy diets for all. Of course, you cannot have any healthy diet when we don't have safe food. So the safety is an important chapter. We go not only into the international safety standards, but also in the national safety standards, and how to promote effective risk assessments. It's also about communication and the management of the communication. No guideline can go without a clear scientific-based approach, but it's also working on how to ensure that knowledge, education, and information is connected to all levels of the value chain in the whole food system. And quite some work still has to be done on that. Often, of course, we speak positively about gender, and gender equity and equality and women's empowerment. But in the guidelines, for the first time, you can read and can see how you can do it. And that's almost more important than just discussing how important gender equality is. And last but not least, we are confronted with many conflicts nowadays. So we're also looking now, and we have guidelines how to deal with resilient food systems in the humanitarian context, to provide guidelines when it comes to conflicts or when we have crises because of climate change. As I said, ladies and gentlemen, in the beginning, we have to implement words into action, and we certainly need you to do it. Governments alone cannot do it anymore. We are realizing that, and we have to create the environment for you to make sure that you can invest in a better future, in more healthy diets, a better planet. Also, it's profitability for the companies. Joining our efforts, joining our strengths can make it happen that we are going to implement those voluntary guidelines. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, for those that overview of the guidelines. It was very, very insightful, and it's a great understanding of the CFS output. It also explains the urgency at hand. And so with that basis and that beginning, I think it was a perfect time to pivot to this discussion of the opportunities and challenges in the Americas. And perhaps before we do that, I can ask all of our participants who haven't done so yet, if they could please rename themselves if they are named as a guest or something else. That will facilitate the discussion, which we hope will be rich after the panel, and we will be able to call on you and understand who is speaking. So now let me call upon our panel to get this discussion started. And we're going to start with Ms. Marcela Rodriguez from Alayab, as she was introduced before. Ms. Rodriguez, please, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Good afternoon, everyone. I am very pleased to be here today. And I want to thank again that CFS private sector mechanism for inviting me to be part of this webinar. I will make my presentation in Spanish because I will be speaking on behalf of the Alliance of Food and Beverage Association in Latin America, Alayab. Alayab es una organización empresarial formalmente establecida, conformada por las principales agrupaciones gremiales que congregan a las industrias de alimentos y bebidas de América Latina y el Caribe. Actualmente, esta alianza cuenta con 24 asociaciones miembros en 15 países del hemisferio, desde México hasta Chile. En Alayab, estamos convencidos del valor del sector privado como actor y aliado estratégico. La industria latinoamericana de alimentos y bebidas a lo largo de los años se ha comprometido con el desarrollo de acciones que atiendan a los principales desafíos globales que guían los objetivos de desarrollo sostenible. En este contexto, las directrices voluntarias sobre los sistemas alimentarios y la nutrición son una herramienta para abordar la malnutrición en los distintos sistemas agroalimentarios de manera coherente y holística. Para el sector de alimentos y bebidas es de vital importancia que en estas directrices ya se hace referencia a una definición objetiva de dieta saludable y que se resalta que una dieta saludable es segura, diversa, equilibrada y basada en alimentos nutritivos. Además, estas directrices consideran las causas multidimensionales de la malnutrición en todas sus formas y los factores fuera de los propios alimentos, por ejemplo, género y niveles de actividad física, entre otros. Las directrices mencionadas indican que el enfoque se debe mantener en lograr una dieta sana y equilibrada en general. No señalan alimentos o bebidas individuales como buenos o malos. En nuestra región, especialmente en Latinoamérica, el debate se ha venido centrando en polarizar esta discusión política justo en eso, en alimentos buenos y en alimentos malos. Y desde Alayab quisiéramos hacer un llamado de atención para que sea la ciencia quien conduzca este tipo de debate con respecto a los temas de alimentación y dietas saludables. Aquí de nuevo el valor que tienen dichas directrices, pues estas se centran en la importancia de que los gobiernos promuevan programas y políticas basadas en información científica robusta y que esta construcción de propuestas se realice de manera transparente e inclusiva a través de mecanismos de gobernanza democrática y responsable. Por último, en las directrices se resalta la importancia de asociar la seguridad alimentaria y la nutrición en periodos de crisis humanitaria con estrategias a largo plazo. En las directrices se recomienda que en este tipo de emergencias se atiendan las necesidades inmediatas en materia de seguridad alimentaria y nutrición. Esto no podría lograrse sin el compromiso productivo del sector privado. Y para esto, estas directrices ofrecen ya un sistema sistemático y multisectorial, tomando en cuenta los sistemas alimentarios en su totalidad. Ya la industria de alimentos y bebidas demostró durante la crisis sanitaria del COVID-19 su capacidad para adaptarse a situaciones adversas y reestructurar los procesos de producción y distribución de alimentos en los diversos eslabones de la cadena agroalimentaria. De esta manera, se ratifica nuestro compromiso de proveer un estándar de alimentación adecuado a las diversas necesidades nutrimentales fundamentales de la población, a fortalecer la resiliencia de los sistemas alimentarios y a mejorar la calidad de la asistencia alimentaria y nutricional. La industria continuará con el compromiso de trabajar con todos los sectores claves de la cadena de producción para construir valor en temas como la urgente recuperación de empleo posterior a la crisis por COVID-19, la mejora de la productividad, el incremento del comercio internacional y la innovación que promueva a la alimentación desde todas sus aristas en los distintos contextos sociales, económicos y ambientales. Quedamos a su disposición para sumar al proceso de discusión sobre sistemas alimentarios en la región, así como la implementación de las directrices voluntarias sobre los sistemas alimentarios y la nutrición. Muchísimas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Marcela. Creo que aclaraste muy bien el valor de las directrices voluntarias y también podíamos entender lo que hemos tratado de apoyar durante todo este proceso. The robust scientific basis of this evidence has been something that we have constantly tried to support, and I'm very happy to say that the value of the multi-stakeholder process was key within CFS, and being able to ensure that private sector's input was taken into account, as well as civil society and everyone else. So we're very pleased to count on associations and companies such as yourself. So thank you very much, Marcela. I'm sure that we will be able to continue discussing many of your points during the question and answer, but now let me turn to Mr. Nick Gardner from the U.S. Dairy Expert Council. Mr. Gardner, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rosemary. And I'm here coming to you from COP, so I apologize if there's any background noise or signal issues, but as Rosemary said, Nick Gardner with the U.S. Dairy Export Council. USDEC is a member organization that supports U.S. dairy exporters. So we represent farmers, co-ops, processors, traders, and exporters. And we're part of a larger group called the Innovation Center for U.S. Dairy that has worked across our industry in the United States to address many of the ongoing and continuing food systems challenges that we face here in the United States as well as around the world. I think starting with a little bit about what we've done, and I think you'll understand as we get into the discussion around the voluntary guidelines, why it's relevant. The U.S. dairy industry, recognizing the incredible challenges that face our environment, our climate, has agreed to an ambitious set of environmental commitments called our Net Zero Initiative and our environmental sustainability commitments. Included in our Net Zero Initiative is a 2050 commitment to greenhouse gas neutrality. And we also have environmental commitments related to water use and water quality. And really those commitments reflect a history of stewardship of the environment by U.S. dairy farmers, processors, and producers, but really they're intended to drive what we see as a marketplace demand. And I think it's well reflected within the approach that the voluntary guidelines has taken. We know that dairy is a healthy, nutritious beverage, contains essential nutrients that are hard to find in many other foods. It's critical in certain life stages, including early in life, later in life as well. It's very culturally important to many populations around the world. We also know there are about 1 billion dairy farmers, there are about 1 billion people involved in dairy production around the world, with 37 million dairy farms headed by women. Yet we recognize that dairy is not environmentally neutral. The production of milk and dairy products does have an environmental cost, and we must consider trade-offs and our impact as we think about the future of the food system. So how does this all relate to voluntary guidelines? Well, as was said, one of the really critical things that the voluntary guidelines has done is it's engaged the HLPE and brought science into what has been often a too politicized discussion about the future of the food system. through negotiations that was noted 133 member states, civil society members, private sector, CGIR, the banks, et cetera, were involved in. We've seen a document that reflects consensus. We've seen a document that reflects science. We've seen a document that reflects risk. And what has come out of that is an approach that embraces a big tent approach. No food is necessarily bad. No approach is necessarily wrong. And that's the type of solutions that we need as we work together to collectively address challenges in front of us. I think that from the US DEC perspective, one of the really notable things about how we contributed to the voluntary guidelines development is that we worked through the PSM, we worked with our government. This process was participatory, it was transparent, and it reflects consensus. And as we've seen through other processes that have tackled difficult problems, difficult challenges with the food system, consensus can be very hard to reach. Science must be brought to the forefront. Transparency is critical, and all stakeholders must have a voice. So really the voluntary guidelines has achieved that. So what does this mean as we think back to the US context that the US Dairy Export Council is most focused on? What we see is a tool, the voluntary guidelines. As has been said, the voluntary guidelines can help operationalize the changes that are necessary within our food system. As US DEC engaged with our government ahead of the Food System Summit, for example, we pointed to the voluntary guidelines as an actionable roadmap that would help to drive food systems transformation. We've embraced many of the same aspects within our own engagement on the voluntary guidelines espouse. In particular, looking at the definition of healthy and unhealthy diets as a roadmap for how we engage on nutrition, noting the importance of considering life stage and thinking about how that impacts health. And ultimately, we've continued to talk about the voluntary guidelines as a model for how we can begin to set policy at the national and global level. The US will be embarking, at least we think, they will be embarking in the future on the development of a food systems plan for the United States. And we're already talking about how the voluntary guidelines and aspects thereof can be adopted as part of that plan. Ultimately, we will continue to work as a dairy industry on our own environmental impact, because we do believe we have a very important role in the future of the food system, given our nutritional contributions, given the way that dairy can be a solution for malnutrition and undernutrition. But we must also recognize trade-offs. We must also lower our environmental impact. And if we follow the roadmap laid out by the voluntary guidelines, we have a way to do that. We have a way to transform our food system that puts people and nutrition first, health, and focus on many other aspects of the food system that often get overlooked in some of the more polarizing debates that are ongoing right now. So with that, Rosemary, I think I will keep it back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick, for joining from COP. We truly appreciate it. It was great to hear all of the concrete examples that you provided that the dairy sector has to offer, and trying to get away from the political exchange. That multi-stakeholders have that ability. You know, the fact that we are involved in these processes kind of gives it a concrete connection to reality. And the regional insights that we can provide, as well as sectoral, I think are some of the things that you brought to the table, Nick, and we greatly appreciate as well. So with that, I'd like to give the floor to the Deputy Director of the Inter-American Institute for Cooperation and Agriculture, Mr. Lloyd Day. It's a pleasure to hear from you and hear about all of the activities going on in nutrition from your sector. Over to you.
Thanks, Rosemary. Can you hear me?
Perfect.
Great. Well, greetings to everyone around the world. I'm calling today from, or dialing in virtually from Sacramento, California, where I'm from. I live and work in Costa Rica for the Inter-American Institute for Cooperation and Agriculture. We represent the 34 member states of the Organization of American States, but we're an independent organization, and our mission is to promote and develop agriculture in the hemisphere. We have been watching the road toward the UN Food Systems Summit before it was announced. The UN system has been talking about transforming food systems for a number of years, and they came to Costa Rica to discuss that at our headquarters. And while we were honored to have such a distinguished assembly, we were very troubled that there were no farmers involved in the meeting. There were no food companies involved in the meeting. And then subsequent to that, we had the announcement of the Food Systems Summit. And so from our perspective, representing the ministers of agriculture of the Western Hemisphere, we thought it very important to convey three simple messages in this process. And that was first, that farmers need to be part of the discussion, that science needs to be the foundation for any kind of public policy, not political science, not aspiration, science. And that third, that agriculture needs to be viewed as part of the solution. There's been a lot of attacks in the narrative leading into this summit, into other things, that agriculture is the villain. And it's not true. And we have some companies participating later that do a marvelous job in providing food globally in a transparent, efficient, and a cost-effective manner. And that needs to be reinforced and improved so that we mitigate our input in the environment, we grow more with less, and that people have the right to choose what they eat, but we give them the proper education related to things like food safety. I think the voluntary guidelines for food systems and nutrition are very important, and they serve as a model for how these kind of discussions ought to develop and ought to find policy outcomes. They're transparent, they're based on consensus, they're based on science. And we were very pleased that in the road toward the Food Systems Summit, we were able to work with all of you, starting in the dairy sector, as our previous speaker, Nick Gardner, just spoke. We spoke to the dairy sector across the hemisphere, the livestock sector, the grains and oilseed sector, the fruit and vegetable sector, to bring the private sector together with the ministers to have these dialogues to talk about what is going to be the future of agriculture and how we transform how we produce in order to meet our climate objectives as well as our nutritional objectives based on the three pillars of sustainability. And we feel it was successful in that we were able to bring consensus among the 34 member states of the Western Hemisphere to present to the UN Food Systems Summit our vision of agriculture, a vision of agriculture that looks at the importance of production, that transforming agri-food systems is vital, but we need to do it with the farmers. That looks at consumer demand and nutritional aspects. The consumers have a right to choose, but that we do a better job of educating them on what a proper, healthy, safe, nutritious diet is. And that's a role for the state, not to tell us what to eat, but how to inform us what to eat. And the market will drive all of that, as it does, as has been doing around the world. The third area that we talked about was the importance of production strategies and environmental factors. I'm here in California on vacation, but I had the opportunity to go next door to my native city, Sacramento, to UC Davis, where they now have an artificial intelligence institute for food systems I can't even remember the name. It's such a long name, but it's an institute that's looking at how to transform food systems using technology. We need to embrace technology. I know the private sector is embracing technology. We need governments to embrace technology and use science as a foundation for that technology, not put up roadblocks or barriers based on, again, political aspirations, not on science. And that's something that we in the Americas are very concerned about. And that's why science was one of the three premises for our discussions for the Food Systems Summit. The issue of food safety and culture that the voluntary guidelines address is very important. And so Codex, which you all work on, is a vital international organization and institution that we must embrace, we must support, and we must not undermine by the political vacillations of any given government, any given union of governments. We must embrace these international organizations, have them abide by science, and use those as the basis for any kind of discussion related to food policy. We cannot, stick our finger in the air and wish or just react to the vicissitudes of different governments, different politics, different consumer demands. We need to base things on science so that you in the private sector have the ability to produce food in a transparent way, in a predictable way that will help feed the world. I am very encouraged by the Committee for Food Security working with the private sector mechanism. So you listen from the private sector so that you help provide governments with the policies to enable an environment in which they can produce, which they have certainty in their production, and we can level the playing field in order to have policy directives in order to produce better, smarter, cleaner, more environmentally friendly. Those are the kind of things that are important. You've done a good work with these voluntary guidelines, and we at IECA are certainly supportive of that. So I'll stop there and wait for other comments.
Many thanks, Deputy Director Day. Very helpful to hear the support, and also it will be great, as you know, it's good to share with you that many of the things that you have said are the threads that we've tried over the course of these 5 years to continue within the policy convergence process of the CFS to keep vocal on. And I think it's worth mentioning that sometimes in these arenas and in these discussion working groups and such, the farmer's voice is not given as much recognition as it should. And farmers are the private sector. And we have made it a point to ensure that that voice is loud and clear, and that there's concrete examples of what they're doing, and that transformation is not or should not be at the burden of the farmer. It's something that everyone needs to work on. And this is the case for nutrition as well. Really great insights. I will ask all of us, and perhaps I'll put it in the chat as well, to please do take a look at the IECA website. They have really a great wealth of publications and really, really good insights that would be great for the region, and especially people working in this space to take a look at. So thank you very much, Deputy Director General, for coming here today and providing that. I'm sure we'll develop that further during the panels, and I'm very, very sure there will be some interesting questions for you. Now I would like to turn to Ms. Stineke Onema. She is coming here to speak from the UN Standing Committee on Nutrition as coordinator, and she has been a very, very helpful partner during this entire process, and we appreciate your time, Stineke. It's been a pleasure working with you on many initiatives, including the UN Decade of Action on Nutrition. So over to you, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Rosemary, and also thank you to all the other speakers. I apologize, I could only join late, so I missed part of the introduction and part of the other speakers. I had to step in somewhere else quite urgently, but happy to be here, and also thank you for the invitation. So maybe 2 words about UN Nutrition and what it is. As Rosemary said, we have been a strong partner and a strong ally throughout the negotiations and even the preparations that led to the negotiations. And UN Nutrition is a coordination mechanism among UN agencies to really speak as one voice, but also act as one UN system, I would say, at country level. During the negotiations, some of you may have heard this as acting, speaking as one voice, and that is exactly what we do. We resulted from the merge of the former UN Standing Committee on Nutrition that was active at global level, working towards policy coherence, and in that capacity already quite active in the Committee on World Food Security. But now that UNSCN merged with the UN Network for SUN, which is a multi-stakeholder platform as well, forming UN Nutrition, forming only one coordinating mechanism for nutrition in the UN system. And I think that makes us an even stronger ally for the CFS as the UNSCN was in the past. So the voluntary guidelines on food systems and nutrition. First of all, you see my smile. A big congratulations again to all actors involved to bring that to a successful end, because it has been quite a process. I'm sure other speakers have mentioned that before. What I've heard from other speakers so far is that notion, that importance that we all attach to it being science-based. It all started with the report of the high-level panel of experts, and I think we need to stick to that. UN Nutrition values science-based support. UN agencies are there to support governments to implement policies and programs that are science-based and that make use of good technical tools. That is what we do as UN, and as UN Nutrition, we support that. So how have we been involved in the establishment and in the coming together, to coming to life of these voluntary guidelines? Of course, we read the HLPE report, and of course, we were engaged in the discussion that followed then, defining the actual scope of what the voluntary guidelines would address following the HLPE report. And after a bit of discussion, it was decided the scope was going to be really broad, encompassing the entire food system. And that is where it started to become complicated at the same time, because food systems, it's broad, it's multi-sectoral, it's multi-stakeholder. Nutrition, in fact, is the same. So if you mix the two, food systems for better nutrition, you create a challenge, I would say. And I think the collective, the multi-stakeholders in the CFS dealt with that quite elegantly and quite well, because here we are with the voluntary guidelines. However, and now I also like to voice a few points of attention here, and that's also how UN Nutrition has been engaged in the process. We, as UN Nutrition, always throughout the negotiations emphasize the evidence-based. And of course, this document in the end is a consensus document. So we are very much aware of that. We, I think, being all of us in the call here, that means that some of the statements that were made initially in this, let's say, the zero draft of the document, have been changed a little bit to allow for consensus of all the parties involved. You could say consensus led a little bit to sometimes weakening some part of the text, or even watering down. Don't quote me there, but we need to be realistic. That doesn't take away from the importance that we have a final document there that can still guide governments in countries, and that still proves to be a very powerful tool. But then as UN Nutrition, we also said, okay, this is the document we have now, but some of these sentences and some of the recommendations, even though they are true, they can be strengthened with a little bit of additional information. That's why the FAO has said it's useful to have an additional platform with additional normative and technical guidance to even better inform the stakeholders in countries, specifically governments, to really be able to implement and use these voluntary guidelines to the best possible extent. So that FAO platform is now online. It got live, I forgot the actual date, I believe during the CFS plenary week. And I all invite you to consult it. It's very well structured. It's structured according to the topics in the voluntary guidelines, and it reflects directly, it refers directly to the several recommendations. So whenever you feel you like to work on a recommendation, you work with a recommendation, do refer to this FAO platform that contains additional guidance, additional technical and normative guidance to guide your steps. That's essential. I'm saying FAO platform, and that's true. It is an FAO platform, but do note that with the help of the UN Nutrition Secretariat, we have invited documentation of a quite large range of UN agencies to supplement and complement what is there already from the FAO side. So it's truly an FAO UN Nutrition side with support of many of the agencies. So that's the voluntary guidelines itself. If I'm allowed, I'd like to say a few more words about the implementation at country level. Now the FAO platform is online. We can also now, as UN Nutrition, proactively distribute the guidelines with our UN contacts in well, in all UN member countries, to really stimulate and advise people. Here are the guidelines, use them. It's a unique tool. It really helps to transform food systems for better nutrition. And in addition, do have a look at the additional documentation that should be used when you start implementing the guidelines. In addition to a mere distribution, as UN Nutrition, we also stand ready to coordinate the several UN agencies at country level in support of governments to implement these same guidelines. Let me see, let me just quickly check my notes if there is an other point I wanted to make there. No, I think that's basically, yeah, the only part I wanted to emphasize is this is a multi-stakeholder, multi-sector tool, which is extremely interesting and not only interesting, but also important. What I like to emphasize as UN Nutrition is that also a little bit in reaction to what I heard from other panelists is that the governments are always the ones that are responsible for making the policies, providing the policies, and setting the policies in a country. And then the multi-stakeholder platforms can there step in support of those government policies. And I think that's how we should also look at the guidelines that have been established with the support and input of those many stakeholders, but then going back to the governments to take those guidelines as their guide in setting those policies, then calling back on the other stakeholders to support the governments there. I hope that made sense to all of you, and I'm open for any questions you may have. Thanks for the opportunity, Rosemary and colleagues.
Thank you very much, Tineke. It was very, very interesting to hear what we've seen over the course of these years, and it's the complexity of the issue being discussed, and also the difficulty of the consensus process. But your rational and your team's rational and pragmatic approach was definitely very helpful throughout. So I think that that was really helpful insight, and which we appreciate very much. Now, I would, last but not least, I want to give the floor to a member of the PSM, the Private Sector Mechanism, Ms. Maria Neri Rivas from Cargill. It's great to have you here because of the role that you played since the beginning of this policy convergence process at the regional consultation phase. But over to you to share your insights, and looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Gracias, Rosemary. Thank you. Good morning, bom dia, boa tarde, good afternoon. I'd like to first welcome Chairman Navarro, Ambassador Navarro, that's now chairing the committee. Also thank Ambassador Hugenben for his interventions and all the fellow panelists, because I think that has brought us to where we are now in trying to, to share the perspective from a multi-stakeholder perspective on this multi-stakeholder effort. So first of all, thank you again, Rosemary, for the invitation. As Rosemary mentioned, I'm Mariana Rivas, and I lead our government relations for Cargill in Latin America. I'm based in San Jose, Costa Rica. So I think it's great to have the opportunity to exchange here and give visibility to the work of the Committee on World Food Security and the guidelines in Latin America. As Rosemary mentioned, Cargill has been involved through the private sector mechanism for many years, and we see the joint efforts on policy, such as these voluntary guidelines presented today, as important tools to engage in multi-stakeholder discussions around important topics that impact food security and nutrition. The multi-stakeholder discussion that took place for 4 years around the voluntary guidelines are really valuable. We're talking about bringing together UN agencies, member states, civil society, the private sector, international and regional financial institutions, research institutions, because we need that to be able to tackle in an inclusive manner the challenges of looking at the food system from different perspectives. For the private sector mechanism, the voluntary guidelines offer guidance to all stakeholders. The guidelines are flexible and should be implemented in a way that fits the local and regional context. The private sector certainly has an important role to play in finding in helping find solutions for the world's most pressing challenges and achieving the sustainable development goals, from addressing climate change to protecting natural resources and improving food security. We're working with farmers, governments, industry groups, customers, and consumers to make the future of food more sustainable. In the case of Latin America, we have to make sure that agriculture and the farmers, just as Lloyd mentioned before, are at the center of the conversation. We recognize the challenges posed by agriculture in diverse contexts. On the one hand, we have countries that are traditional leading agricultural producers and exporters. And on the other hand, we have markets that are working to have a more diversified agriculture offering. Across the spectrum of agriculture in Latin America, farmers and their livelihoods need to be at the center. In this context, I would like to call out some of the content of the voluntary guidelines in areas which we believe are core to securing nutrition for all and to enable food system transformation. These 4 areas have to do with the role of farmers, the role of trade, the role of food security, and the role of public-private partnerships. On the role of farmers, the voluntary guidelines call upon private sector to support farmers to adopt sustainable agricultural practices, increase their resilience, and manage the impact of climate change. Cargill wants to be at the forefront of innovation and is looking into how technologies can help farmers adapt to climatic conditions. One of the aspects that holds the most promise is the current technological revolution of technology, which is reshaping and redefining the agricultural and food sectors. From enabling farmers to implement more precise farming methods, to the use of satellite and drone images and data to obtain greater insight around global supply and demand, which can also help us in turn adapt to new climatic conditions. Technology supports food safety, sustainability, livelihoods, and access to information. That is certainly an area where government support and public-private partnership could live the challenges, could partner to face the challenges that exist today in Latin America for providing access to these technologies to all farmers of all sizes. Training and direct support are key as well. Globally, since 2017, 4.1 million farmers have attended our trainings for sustainable agricultural practices, with a goal of 10 million by 2030, and we're getting close to actually reaching that goal before 2030. Together with CARE, for example, we are providing agronomic training to communities in Central America, in particular Honduras, Guatemala, and Nicaragua. The result is more productivity, more yields, more income for crops that go from sorghum to red beans, green beans, blackberries, and peas. Another example, Cargill, Mexico, together with Heifer International and Educampo Chiapas, works to strengthen female participation throughout the agribusiness value chain. The organizations offer women skills, tools, and resources needed to empower their production, business management, and their own lives. By 2021, Hatching Hope Mexico, so by this year, the organization plans to impact 6.5 million people through increasing awareness and education around the production, promotion, and consumption of poultry with a focus on eggs. Again, placing the farmer at the center, and in particular, female farmers. Another element that I would like to call out is the role of trade. Cargill advocates trade and functioning markets as enablers of global food and nutrition security and as contributors to economic development of farmers and to sustainable agriculture by allowing farmers to grow the crops that best fit for their local soils and climate and trace these crops, having a positive impact on the broader local communities. Trade policies can facilitate the free movement of goods, services, and capital. We support policies that are developed within a rules-based system that builds trust among all parties and ensures that all are competing on a fair and level playing field. With the same responsibilities, equal access to markets, and an equal opportunity to compete in those markets. Policies, as has been mentioned before, should be based on science and encourage harmonized standards so trade can flow. Policies should not send mixed signals to farmers or misdirect investment. In Latin America, trade is key to meet food and nutrition needs in the region. We need to think about how we move towards more regional frameworks to facilitate trade. For example, how do we move towards more standards in regulation around customs, exports, inputs, and food security? And food safety as well. So going on to food safety, we recognize, and it has been mentioned here, that food safety is key to achieving global food and nutrition security. Based on Cargill's day-to-day experience and actions to uphold food safety across agro-food supply chains, we are pleased with food safety being retained under a specific heading in the voluntary guidelines. To contribute to food safety, governments are to take a comprehensive, science-based approach towards harmonizing food safety rules and practices across borders. We also believe in the power of public-private collaboration to address food safety issues and to establish standards and policies that improve the overall supply chain and build trust with customers. And this brings me to the last point that I want to call out regarding the voluntary guidelines, which is the role of public-private partnership. This panel itself, it shows us how important this is. We as a company and other companies that are part of the private sector mechanism have experience in agriculture, have experience in food. We as a company promote agricultural sustainable practices because they can have an impact on food security. We want to find ways for farmers to contribute to a more sustainable future. And we should think about farmers of all sizes when we look at access to technology and access to innovation as related to climate change. We enable farmers to access markets by operating efficient value chains. We mitigate against price volatility through risk management tools. We contribute to food safety across the value chain. And we develop innovative solutions for agriculture and food, which are key to the food system transformation. That's what we do. We have been doing that for 150 years. Yet, we know that we cannot do it alone. No single stakeholder is able to swift and make sustainable change with real impact on its own. Public-private partnerships offers an opportunity to access resources, expertise, support, to help address key issues in the food systems. This helps us to share risk, cover implementation costs, and be a catalyst for further change. We have experience with public-private partnership. I shared a couple of examples before when we talked about working with farmers, working with communities, and working with local governments. So for us, the role of the farmer, the role of trade, the role of food safety, and in particular, the role of private partnerships, it's key to be able to move forward the food systems agenda globally and in Latin America in particular. In closing, we recognize the value in the process that got us to where we are today with the voluntary guidelines on food safety and nutrition. Such processes are fundamental as we look at food systems in Latin America because they bring together diverse stakeholders to find solutions that we know are not simple and that require joint commitments and actions, and as it has been mentioned before, to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianelli, for those words and the comprehensive examples, suite of actions and strategies that Cargill brings to the table to try to chip away. And it's been a pleasure to have you as an active member of the private sector mechanism. I would like to just thank the whole panel for your complementary perspectives, and I would like to now open the floor for questions from the audience for our panelists. Please do raise your hands or use the chat function at the bottom of the screen, and you can you have the opportunity to ask the panelists directly. Ambassador Hugoven, who has an answer for everything, a very good answer for everything, as well as our new chair, which we are so excited to have, Chair Ferrero here, able to get to know PSM a little bit more by being here today, and also our individual members. So I'm going to open the floor. Please do raise your hand. I can, though, break the ice a little bit and perhaps get this discussion started. Marianelli was speaking on one of her last points on the importance of trade. And I'd like to say that we've been really welcoming the discussions that the CFS has been having in conjunction with the WTO on really important issues in trade dialogues, I believe they're called. And we're hopeful that under the chairmanship, these discussions will continue. It's a great way to continue the discussions that we have seen happen in a more limited way during the negotiations on the guidelines, and get the viewpoint from a wider stakeholders within different fields of work. So not only based here in Rome or within the CFS or within FAO, but also WTO. So we really appreciate that. With that, please don't be shy and raise your hands for any questions for the panelists. Unless the presentation was very informative and people don't have questions, perhaps someone from the panel may want to take the floor and comment on other people's presentations, or perhaps the chair would like to take the floor and discuss any comments that you may have had on the basis of the discussions.
Thank you, Rosemary. And if there is no other panelist keen to take the floor, which I invite Mary, Hans, Marianelle, Maria, would like to intervene, then I have taken many notes. So I would like to share if possible, but I'll try to do that after Hans or Maria or Marcela, Lloyd.
Absolutely. I know that there was a perhaps a question on regarding the food security element and how these guidelines could actually address food security issues. Is there someone in particular that from the panel that would like to speak on this?
I can start, Rosemary, and then I'm sure my fellow panelists will have a lot to add as well. I think that, when we talk, and Lloyd spoke also as well about talking about the farmers, when we look at food security, we need to look at, different elements. One is what we're doing short term, what we're doing short term in terms of, in some cases, we go all the way, and one of the guidelines talk about humanitarian issues. So we go all the way from preparing for what's called humanitarian relief to making sure that as we work with farmers and we give them the tools, we contribute to their productivity on the incomes in the communities. But there is indeed, because of the numbers we've seen and the reality in Latin America, there is a need to provide more support. So how do you provide that support? one of the ways is partnerships, partnerships, whether it's with UN agencies, with donor agencies and governments, to have programs that actually bring food to people that need it. So I think that, the issue of not only for humanitarian elements, but also for, for day-to-day, making sure that we work together to improve income so that people can actually access and get food. But at the same time, when that doesn't happen, we as companies can also contribute to our programs. So I mentioned the program in Mexico. We have other programs in Colombia, all over the region. And one of the ways we do it is with the farmers, but also looking beyond and looking at their families and looking at school meal programs. And we do that with different partners. And those are just some examples. But I think that when we look at midterm and long term, then we need to think about resilience, and how do we help the communities, the farmers become more resilient. So I think that, and there is no, again, I mentioned some of our programs, and they do help, and we're really proud of those programs. But I think that, how do we scale those programs? And in many cases where we have been successful at scaling our food security programs, it has been because we partner with governments, because the governments are the ones who can access thousands and thousands of schools, for example, to get meals to young kids. And the governments are the ones that can help us get to thousands of farmers or millions of farmers, because of their extension programs as well. So I think that, we have to tackle it in different ways, but we do have to recognize there is a pressing need, and we need to have programs, and those programs need to be scaled, but also not forget about what we're doing from the resilience perspective. And I do think that, to call out specifically the role of women that's called out in the voluntary guidance, but the role of women farmers and the role of women in building that resilience as well.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, Maria Nelly. Ambassador Hugevin.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I very much agree with what was said by Maria Nelly. I think, of course, food safety and food security go hand in hand, and everything starts with the farmers. And the most important thing is also, when you look to food safety, are we getting enough technology and innovations to the farmer? And everything depends on accessibility, affordability, and implementability. And there, of course, it's not only many that look to I would say, either the global level organizations like FAO or WHO, or they're looking to the governments. But I think the private sector can play a crucial role, because everything related to food safety and giving those technologies to the farmers is, of course, also about fair pricing. If the farmers get a fair price where they can produce in a safe way with the technologies given to them, I think you will get, I would say, a better value chain approach when it comes to food safety. But it's also making sure that the governments have the technologies in their laboratories to check the safety of the products. And there you see, of course, a difference, for example, between Europe and between Africa and Southeast Asia. I think it's up to the governments, especially in Europe and in developed countries, to support, I would say, the governments to make sure that they have those labs and the equipment to check the safety, because then it relates to trade as well. Because only if we make sure that there is a market access for farmers in developing countries, you can improve trade. And with improving trade, you can improve sustainability and more healthy diets. And last but not least, at the global level, I think it's absolutely crucial, which was also shown now by the G20 last weekend here in Rome, that we have a One Health approach, an approach where FAO, WHO, OEA, in close cooperation with UNEP, make sure that we have one approach to support the farmers, and make sure that we also have one approach when it comes to the food safety standards to support food security. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Over to you, Deputy Director General Boyd.
Thank you, Rosemary. I was going to raise my hand to maybe break the ice with questions, and this could go to either the ambassador or the chair. This has been a very rich discussion, and I would like to congratulate and thank all the panelists and participants. As I mentioned in my comments, we have some concern in the Americas about certain standards being placed upon the export of our products or the production of our products that aren't necessarily based on science. And I know that CFS works directly with Codex Alimentarius, probably with the OIE and other standard setting bodies, as well as the WTO SPS committee. And I'm just wondering if there's any comments by the chair or by Ambassador Hans. I'm not going to try to pronounce your last name, even though I do live in a Dutch hotel in Costa Rica. And I learned how to say Wageningen. But besides that, I'm not too good. But I would like to, have your comments based on where you're from and where this is going, because I think it's troublesome for, I know, our producers and our companies that some standards are being changed and aren't based on Codex or not based on the OIE. And I wanted to see if you had any comments on that.
Thank you, Lloyd. Perhaps I can give it to Ambassador Hoogeveen and then the chair. Is that okay?
You can always say, I know how difficult my my name is, so most people know me by Hans, so that's it's easier. But I think it's a crucial question. If we want to transform our food systems, if we want to guarantee food safety, and if we want to improve food security, we have to live by and produce by internationally agreed standards. And for that, we have the Codex Alimentarius. And we have to make sure that those standards are science-based. Because I agree with you, it would be impossible for the private sector to produce in a sustainable way if the standards are either changing every half year, or that we have standards which are not based on science. And what I've seen now for certainly the last couple of years in Rome, certainly with FVO and also discussion CFS, all the member states are agreeing that we can only work based on science and facts and evidence. So for that, I think we have to make sure that we have a science-based approach when it comes to standards, and it is very much related to food safety. And of course, the rest is up to the consumers, but it's different when it comes to food safety standards. They can only come, I would say, from the Codex Alimentarius. Thank you.
Over to you, Ambassador Ferrero.
Thank you, Rosemary. And well, I fully agree with what my colleague, dear Hans, said, and with you, Lloyd. I mean, standards is one of the keys. Indeed, yes. And what has to do with food safety and the Codex, of course, yes. And it is actually part of the responsibility of government and in least developed countries, so of international development cooperation, to strengthen the capacities of smallholders and family farmers and the local food systems to actually match these standards progressively and accomplish. Of course, yes. And I would like to add something some more to the standards dimension. It's not related to food safety necessarily or to the Codex, but this also applies to the ways in which we assess sustainability's accomplishment by the different produce or value chains, or in general, the business community. I recall how the CEO of BlackRock, I think it was last 2 years ago at the Financing for Development Forum in New York, actually was advocating strongly and asking with all his strength for standards, for globally agreed standards to assess sustainability. He mentioned actually their investments on the food sector and agriculture sector, but it going beyond, of course. So these standards applies from my perspective to food safety, but are equally needed to having level playing fields and very clear orientations to the business and investors community on what sustainability means, or how to ground the sustainable development goals into business models in a way that empowers business community to be also accountable to shareholders and broader to stakeholders.
Very interesting, Chair Ferrero. Thank you for that. I know that, Nick, you had your hand up before I go over to Chair Ferrero's closing remarks. Over to you, Nick.
Yeah, thanks, Rosemary. And I was really actually going to bring in the trade component into your food security and nutrition question. And I think that the comments in regards to Codex have been really good as well. One of the troubling things that we have noticed in the conversation about food systems is there seems to be a bit of an anecdotal assumption that food that is in international trade is inherently less sustainable than locally produced or locally sourced food. And I think that for a variety of reasons, and what the voluntary guidelines have done a particularly good job of is encompassing how trade can be a critical solution for empowering farmers, particularly women, bringing nutrient-rich or nutrient-dense foods into areas that may not have those foods necessarily within their local production or in their traditional diet. Dairy, for example, is a very good additive to a plant-based diet to help bridge some of those nutrients that may not be available. But it's really, really critical that we understand as well how food production works. And, you know, for those of us who are sitting here from Latin America, in the United States, we enjoy a variety of fresh produce that we certainly cannot grow sustainably in the United States, but they grow very well in some of the tropical climates in Latin America. And I think that we as a CFS community can work together to really, really augment the importance of trade in these discussions, the importance of global standards. I do agree that a level playing field is critical. How we do that in sustainability, I think it's a bigger question, but certainly from a food safety perspective, relying on Codex and talking about the benefits of trade for food security and nutrition are critical. So thank you.
Thank you, Nick. So I think this is a great segue. Unless there are any questions, I'm checking to see if I don't see any raised hands. So I think this would be great to hand over the floor to Chair Ferrero so that you can deliver your closing remarks.
Thank you, Rosemary, and thanks for this wonderful moderation. And thanks everyone for this discussion. This has been lovely and useful. Well, we come to the end of this session that, from my view, has highlighted the need and the usefulness of global policy guidance, yet adapted to each specific context, each community, country, value chain, sector, or company. Well, there are several messages I will take over, some of which I heard strongly during this discussion, and I took note of at least 5 very important messages. Well, the first one is that it is time to act, that no time is to be lost, with the attempt to act now, but with the proper combination of the short, medium, and long-term perspective on the decisions we make and on the way in which we approach what it is indeed a process of transformation that will take some time, but we need to put our eyes on the long term to make the proper decisions in the short term. It is time to act by all stakeholders, and this includes governments and businesses. Governments, of course, providing enabling environments, proper policies, public policies, and ensuring a level playing field through incentives and through regulatory frameworks that work. On the business side, integrating into your business models and strategies, advertising and branding, what has to do with the food systems transformation and your responsibility. And this also includes empowering investors to consider the systemic impacts when they assess the investments, their investments in the food sectors. And this links to the discussion we just had about standards needed. But it also has to do with the United Nations, indeed, which we actually as a committee or as a broader system, multilateral system, should be providing overall agreed and consensual policy guidance. And this is the function of the Committee on World Food Security and of these voluntary guidelines. And this is also the case with the principles for responsible investments that the CFS adopted some years ago, or on the voluntary guidelines on responsible tenure of land, fisheries, and natural resources, just to put some examples. And on this point, as a conclusion of this first one, is that we need to act together, that we need to do this through multi-stakeholder platforms at the global level, being the CFS, in a concrete context, locality or territory. It will be a form of public-private partnership. And this has to do with all levels. On my second point I will take out is that agriculture is a part of the solution, that we tend to put the focus on the impacts, negative impacts of agriculture, but that with the appropriate farming systems, and this includes, as the CFS also worked upon during this last year, agroecology and other sustainable agriculture innovative practices, agriculture indeed is the most powerful carbon capture technology we have. it can preserve biodiversity and ecosystems. It can restore soils and biodiversity, preserve water, scarce water resources, while at the same time and with the proper farming systems provide decent jobs and decent incomes to farmers, to cooperatives and small and medium enterprises. So agriculture is part of the solution. We have an enormous opportunity as well on food systems transformation from this perspective. My third point is I hear strongly that no food is on itself necessarily bad, that it is on the total nutritional outcome of a diet what makes it healthier and nutritious. So we need to focus as well on the overall outcomes and the impacts and see the broader picture and not just focusing on one specific food, just taken out from its context and put on a lab to be analyzed. The fourth point is very closely related with the third one, which is the need to assess sustainability of food systems, not in isolation of the ecosystem, of the culture, of the society where it is functioning, where food is produced or processed. As an example, I used to use actually quite often, well, milk can be perfectly sustainable and contribute to decent jobs and livelihoods, or milk can be harming natural resources or making not decent jobs. It's not about milk, it's about in the way in which it's integrated in the territory, it's integrated with farmers, it's integrated with workers, it's integrated with the ecosystems in which they are produced. So it depends on how, on by whom, and where it is produced. The corollary, my fifth point, is that systems thinking, an holistic approach is the key, indeed, of the food system transformation. It is key to assessing impacts on health, on people, on planet, and on shared prosperity. And this is the systemic approach we should undertake within our own institutions. In my case now, the Committee on Welfare Security, in your case, on your value chains or your sector associations or your companies. And this applies also to science, and this is my last point. Science was underscored during the discussion as one of the key issues to be linked with decisions that needs to be taken to transform food systems. Science that should also undertake this systemic approach, this holistic approach, so integrating multiple disciplines. It is about agronomics, it is about chemistry, it is about biology, but it is also about social science, economics, or politics. And with this has been my takeovers, Rosemary, of this rich conversation. There are many more and richer arguments, but I will synthesize in these 6 points what I heard. And well, with this privilege of making this closing remark and sharing my conclusion with all of you, well, it's that we can finish this session, this very session. One of my key aims as chair of the CFS in these coming 2 years is enhance the connection of the committee with the responsible business community, efforts, as well as increase the impact of what we do at the global level in the ground, better linking with the actors that are actually operating in the ground, meaning governments, meaning businesses, small and medium enterprises, farmers. And I hope that this event has contributed to this goal. And my last sentence, my last message will be: your work as private sector mechanism is an essential part of this chain between the global deliberations and impact. So thank you very much indeed to all of you. Thank you, Rosemary. Thanks, panelists, for this. Has been a privilege to be here today with you. Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a great rest of your night.